he will get logged in soon. So good evening. I'm Karen Forget, and I'm the Executive Director of Lynnhaven River NOW, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here to our 12th Annual Candidates Forum, and the first year that we're doing them virtually. Joining us tonight are the two candidates for the Kempsville district seat, Jessica Abbott and Bill Dale. And the three candidates for the Rose Hall district seat, Michael Berlucchi, Garry Hubbard.
Thank you.
And we're hoping that Conrad Schesventer will be logging on shortly. And we also have with us Sabrina Wooten, who is a candidate for the Centerville district seat. Her opponent, Wray, had a last-minute conflict and is not going to be able to join us tonight. Also on the panel are Emily Hatfield, our LR Now IT coordinator, who is working behind the scenes to make sure everything runs smoothly. Jim Deppie, our LR Now advocacy coordinator, and Helen Coons, our assistant director. Helen will be serving as our timekeeper. She will raise a sign to let the candidates know how much time remains in their responses. Jim Deppie and I will ask 5 questions. The questions will appear in one of the panel grid boxes and should be visible to the candidates and the participants. If you are not familiar with Zoom, you will find controls in the upper right corner that allow you to move from a speaker view to gallery view. In gallery view, you'll be able to see all of the panelists. Each candidate will have a set response time. Please pay attention to our timekeeper. For question 1, it will be 2 minutes each. For questions 2 and 3, it will be 1.5 minutes each. Question 4 will have 3-minute responses. And question 5 will be back to 2-minute responses. And we'll remind you of these times at the beginning of each question. We will also change up the order of respondents for each question. After the 5th question, each candidate will have 2 minutes for a closing statement. The candidates can remain unmuted unless we have some audio interference. If that happens, we will ask you to mute and unmute yourselves as appropriate. All other participants will be muted and we will not be activating the chat function. Lastly, we will be recording the forum and will send each participant a link and be publicizing that link for those who are unable to join us tonight. With that, let's get started and hope that that Conrad Schesventer is able to log on shortly. So Jim Deppie will be asking the first question.
Good evening. Our first question is on tree canopy in Virginia Beach. Sea level wise is the city's comprehensive program for addressing rising sea levels and recurring flooding risks. The adaptation strategy published in March 2020 outlines a proactive, long-term approach to enable the city of Virginia Beach to adapt to these changing environmental conditions. Among the nature-based flood mitigation strategies addressed in the program is forest restoration, enhancement, and creation. According to the latest urban tree canopy report, Virginia Beach continues to fall short of its 40% urban tree canopy coverage recommended for mid-Atlantic cities of comparable size. And so the question has 3 parts. What are the challenges associated with tree canopy loss in your district and in Virginia Beach What specific initiatives will you support to help us meet Virginia Beach's forest restoration, enhancement, and creation goals? And finally, is this an important strategy in combating flooding? Our first candidate to answer will be from Centerville, Sabrina Wooten.
Well, thank you for your question.
Tree canopy is an area that I certainly have to familiarize myself with. I do understand that we have had a resolution that has been set forth by one of our members on council where they did express that Virginia Beach needs to focus more on forestry. And I believe you listed several of those items. Unfortunately, I can't remember all of them, but forestry, a reforestry program, and you mentioned some other items. Do I believe that tree canopy, forestry, and programs of that nature are important to address sea level rise and flooding? Absolutely. And the resolution that I mentioned previously, I certainly have supported and expressed interest in, because anything that we can use that is innovative, that will address flooding in our area, certainly I do support it. Specifically in the Centerville area, we do have some areas that do flood. And, you know, has been my job and actually my interest to ensure that those areas that are flooding, that we look to see if those are vulnerable areas and address those areas, you know, and prioritize those areas. On my time on council, I have sponsored a resolution for the American Flood Coalition, and that coalition helps us with natural resources to address flooding and to address sea level rise. And so as a advisory member of that coalition, I will continue to look for natural resources and innovative programs like the Tree Canopy program that will help Virginia Beach in these areas as it relates to flooding and sea level rise.
Thank you for your answer. Next is Jessica Abbott from Kempsville.
Hi, thank you all so much. Well, I would first like to say tree canopies, trees in general are nature's pump station. We desperately need to preserve the forestation, the forests that we have, and we need to encourage more forestation where it's possible. The ordinance that Councilwoman Wooten mentioned is the ordinance that Councilwoman Henley brought forward, and it passed, I believe, unanimously on council. And what it did was it was a one-to-one replacement. So if a tree had to come down due to development, another tree had to go up in its place. And of course, I was happy to support that. I think we have to take it a step further. We need to be creative. We need to look at bioswales. We need to look at our rain barrel programs. We need to look at development in high-risk floodplains and how do we plan around all of that. One of the things that I've done on council since taking the seat is I helped preserve 9 acres of severe repetitive loss property and preserve it into being a forest. And we did that in partnership with Elizabeth River NOW and created Ferry Point Park. And that's a big deal because it was a great example of taking a property that was previously residential, but was not a good home in terms of it being a high flood risk, and we were able to turn it into a neighborhood park, and it serves a greater purpose now. And I think we have to think critically at how we can do that more often. We have another park coming online in Kempsville as well. That one is probably not going to be a forestation project since it's right on right in the main intersection in the historic district, but it is an example of how when we are developing areas that we can make sure that we preserve green space and give every opportunity for those tree canopies to continue to exist in the city.
Thank you, Jessica. Next is William Dale.
Jim, thanks very much. And let me begin by saying thank you for having us on. Really do appreciate that. Forestation, I think we have to start off by remembering that in the time of development in this city, standard practice for development was to uproot every tree on the property and then build these massive housing developments. And we're probably suffering as a result of that. It takes a little while for trees to grow, particularly deciduous trees. And I think Barbara Henley's right on the mark in terms of saying that you replace one for one. I'm not sure how you replace all of the trees that were lost in order for development to take place. But certainly it's not unrealistic to recognize that when you have that large a number of trees removed, flooding is going to be a problem, since they are a primary source of pulling up excess water and waters that fall down. It might be a tactic that is used reasonably in those 14 districts where flooding is a real problem, to see where it is possible to do some forestation, if not forestation, simple tree planting, with trees that are able to start to abate that. I think it might also be a serious factor with erosion that takes place along the coastal areas. Historically, coastal areas had a number of trees and forests that moved right up to the water. Obviously, that's gone, and the erosion that takes place is not surprising. Would support efforts to put that back in place, but honestly would look for guidance from people who really know a lot more about that, not only where to plant, but also what are the appropriate trees to plant. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll move on to Rose Hall District. First up, Michael Berlucchi.
Well, good evening. I'm delighted to be here with you this evening. Thanks for hosting this forum. My name is Michael Berlucchi, and I have the privilege and responsibility of serving on our City Council from the Rose Hall District. I was an enthusiastic supporter of the aforementioned resolution to replace trees one for one that the city has to take down. One of the challenges that's faced by the implementation of this resolution is that it's limited to trees that are destroyed by the city. And it's a good start, but it just reflects how much work we still have to do. In the Rose Hall District, for example, which was most substantially impacted by Hurricane Matthew in 2016, and we all know is significantly impacted by recurrent flooding, and particularly as it relates to stormwater, trees can be a huge help in being part of the infrastructure of tools with which we use to combat recurrent flooding. So I'm a strong advocate for Lynnhaven River NOW's efforts to educate the public, both the commercial private sector, residential home builders, and residents about the importance of preserving and maintaining trees in new and existing construction. One of the challenges we have in Rose Hall is that there are a lot of commercial properties, vast expanses of commercial properties where there are no trees. So as we think about strategies to infill those spaces, we'll have to think about how to incorporate trees and other landscaping into those properties. And we'll have to do a better job of working with residents to emphasize the importance of maintaining trees. So I'm a strong advocate for both natural and engineered solutions to recurrent flooding and sea level rise, and trees are absolutely an important part of that strategy, and one that I'm enthusiastically supportive of.
Thank you. Next up is Garry Hubbard.
Yes, thank you for having this forum, and thank you, Karen and Jim and Helen. As you may know, I'm a commercial contractor in the commercial and residential construction fields. I've seen the actual stripping down of the fields and the farmland in order to develop these products. I'm also a farm boy. I grew up in Kentucky, and I understand dramatically how trees can affect and mitigate the flooding issues that we have now. We need to plant more than 1 per 1, maybe 3 to 1. We've got to restore some of our trees and some of our grasses to actually understand why we're having these problems that we are. We're looking at a twofold increase. We're looking at the sinking or the subsidence of our lands. We need a buffer to help with mitigating the flooding. And I also understand why we're in this situation. We've got to look at what happened in Windsor Woods. One of the things that happened there was my sister-in-law lost her home, her cars, and had to go live with a friend of hers because she no longer could afford her home. The actual pollution and runoff from that area and from that storm was absolutely horrendous. My son and I, we're working on a program now to reduce the pollution and trash, and we'll get into that maybe later. But as for now, we've got to actually increase maybe our tree planting, increase our understanding of why our waterways are more polluted now, and the actual work that we need to do, and learn from agencies such as Lynnhaven Now to actually look at somehow educating the public to actually stop this. I've been an avid fisherman. The Chesapeake Bay is a crown jewel of Virginia, and we need to make sure our waterways are there for our grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you. We are working to try to get Conrad Schesventer logged in. Emily's texted and called him, so we're working on it. But we will move on to our second question. So the second question deals with transportation, and each of you will have a minute and a half for residents age 65 and older make up the fastest growing population group in Virginia Beach. As people age, at some point, most limit or eliminate driving their own vehicles. Studies show that millennials prefer public transportation and that inadequate public transportation options disproportionately affect minority and low-income communities. And lastly, traffic and the impervious surface required to accommodate ever-growing numbers of cars adversely affect air and water quality. We all know that public transportation options in Virginia Beach are limited. Number one, do you agree that we need to expand public transportation? Number two, what do you see as the top challenges associated with public transportation in Virginia Beach? And what solutions do you propose to address them? And number three, what would be your first step? And we will begin with Gary Hubbard from Rose Hall.
Yes, Karen. I have posted about transportation, and quite frankly, transportation is one of the issues that I intend to actually straighten out. I've actually met with HRT, and quite frankly, our transportation is abysmal. It is no longer just transportation. This is something that we need for our resilience, maybe to attract new businesses to our area. We're going to have to actually now increase bus routes, maybe smaller buses to actually increase the frequencies of pickup and extend the routes, and also come up with a campaign to make it viable and make more people want to ride the bus. We're no longer a viable situation for the Lynnhaven or the Tide, but there is a right-of-way that we have that we've spent money on that maybe we can somehow utilize this right-of-way as a shuttle service back and forth to get more cars off the road. And quite frankly, we're going to have to actually work with the bus services that we have now. Uber is not a viable situation. The cost for getting back and forth to work, a friend of mine takes 2 hours to get to work and 2 hours to get back to home. That's wasted time, wasted money, and wasted resources that we need to make sure that we can actually have a viable bus service. So we're going to have to work on that situation. I'm not privy to what the city is trying to work with the city council with, but we need to change the status quo. We need to actually upgrade more routes and more people riding our public transportation. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Berlucchi.
Well, Karen, I'm a supporter of public transportation for all the reasons you mentioned. Having a robust public transportation system would be good for our economy. It will help us retain and attract good talent, as well as new firms to our region and to our city. It's good for our environment, of course, and it's really important for the matters of equity, fairness, financial opportunity, that we have a system that serves everyone, people with disabilities, people with low income, and otherwise. And I do agree that we need to expand it. And I believe that some of the challenges we face there are accessibility, reliability, frequency. There's a reason many people in Hampton Roads don't ride the system, is because it's cumbersome. It takes a long time to get places, and it's just frankly not easy to use. So I think what we need to do is work together, of course, with HRT to implement efficiencies in the system and new technologies that are constantly evolving and becoming more and more available, that will make improvements in all the areas that I mentioned, making public transportation more accessible, more frequent, easier to use. And we have the capability to do that. We just have to have the will in order to do it. And I believe that we have a Virginia Beach City Council that does have that will, that recognizes the importance, and it's up to us really to emphasize that policy direction to our staff and to HRT to make sure that they know that it's time to come up with a response that works for everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. And welcome, Conrad. We're gonna give you a few minutes to get settled, and then we'll come back to you on this question. We'll move on to our Kempsville candidates, and we'll start with Bill Dale.
I think the first question with public transportation that has to be dealt with is the realization that it has to be a loss leader. You know, oftentimes the discussion around it is that it's going to pay for itself. I think realistically it's not, and we just have to accept that fact. Virginia Beach is a postmodern city. That means there's no downtown. There never was one. The city's built around shopping areas, and those shopping centers become the focal points for the neighborhoods. There are two transportation routes that are presently existing. One is the Princess Anne corridor, the other is the Virginia Beach corridor. They move from one side of the city to the other, but oftentimes they miss those shopping areas that people are aiming for and are looking for. Satellite buses or smaller buses might be helpful, but again, they're going to be loss leaders. They're probably not going to pay for themselves, but their benefit is they will allow for people who need transportation to get to those places where they need to, or to get to the tide if they need to get downtown. The fact that the satellites that take the military people to the bases are packed all of the time is an indication that this is something that is looked upon favorably by the people of the community. So I think we have to recognize that it's going to be costly. We have to accept that cost, and then we have to build in a structure that allows for people to get to the places where they want to go.
Thank you. Jessica Abbott.
Thank you. Well, I think the first thing we have to acknowledge with well, let me first off say, I 100% agree. We have to do better with our transportation. It is not a realistic mode of transportation as it exists today. Our bus system is, as Councilman Berlucci said, it is cumbersome. It takes a long time to get somewhere if you want to be a public transit user. It's if you have to get to work, it isn't feasible. That said, our biggest hurdle in my eyes is rebuilding the trust that our public transit system can be something more than it is. I think the people that have to use public transit use it, and they grit their teeth and they say, I wish this was better. But the people that we'd also like to use it, the millennials, the seniors, these groups of people that are moving away from regular vehicular use, they don't trust our transportation system. And I think a lot of that is, speaks to a concern that we aren't with the times. We have to implement better technology on our bus lines and in all of our transportation system. Another thing that I've talked about since I was elected in 2017 is that we have great trail systems within our city that do not connect. If you look at cities out west, cities with really robust transportation systems, they also have really robust urban trail systems. And that's a really great way for people, particularly in Kempsville. I talk to a lot of road bikers and some families that like to walk. And one of the things they're always telling me is it would be great if this walking path connected with the Norfolk Southern right-of-way, or if it connected with another trail that could get them to another part of the city, because there are many people that would ride their bike to the oceanfront from, say, Kempsville, or would get their kids in a stroller and walk to town center. It's really not that far if there was a really feasible way for people to walk safely to and from all of these hot spots, places you want to be, the gathering places in our community. So in addition to implementing the latest technology, to looking at collaborations with rideshare programs, we also need to really finish what we started with our trails and put our money where our mouth is on and developing a robust urban trail system.
Jessica, I hate to interrupt, but you're past your time limit, so thank you.
That's okay, I'm done.
All right, thank you. And move on to Sabrina Wooten.
So I certainly do support expanding our transportation system. There are several reasons that have already been mentioned by participants as it relates to the challenges of transportation in our city. And I really think it's important to do an awareness campaign because I think everyone can agree there's a problem, but we don't all agree on how to address that problem with transportation. There have been studies that have been done, and we can look at our bus systems in Centerville. I know that in the 2019-2020 budget, there was money allocated to extend the bus rail system in the Centerville district, which is a great help, but even with that investment, some people did say, well, are there still people riding the buses? And I believe there are, but we still have to, make sure that we're making a smart investment in our bus systems. We have to make sure there's connectivity. So that means we have to look at regional opportunities to work with Norfolk, Chesapeake, and other areas because they're having some of the same issues that we are. And it just makes sense to work along with our regional partners in this effort. So along with, looking at ways where we can extend our bus transportation systems, working regionally and getting out a campaign of awareness to our community and finding out what are the best ways that our community would like our transportation to expand. It's very important, also, as well as innovative ideas like autonomous cars. Those are things to look into, but also walkable communities because, most of our millennials do like walkable communities. And that's something that we're going to have to look at and investigate and invest in the future.
Thank you. Conrad, we're going to come to you, Conrad Schesventer, and let me just repeat the questions quickly. The questions are, do you agree that we need to expand public transportation? What do you see as the top challenges? And what solutions would you propose? And what would be your first step?
Climbing the economic ladder away from poverty requires many variables like low crime and good schools and two-parent households in the community, but the strongest variable correlated to escaping poverty is commuting time. So yes, access to strong and fast transit is sort of like economic steroids for a region. The tonic for our region is an efficient rapid bus transit system that's geographically wide sweeping, which when you compare that to light rail, that was just one strip, it wasn't very broad. So we assuredly need to expand public transit. The challenges come from a sort of more of a status quo minded council. If this region's set to a glistening rapid bus transit system, we can help reduce cars on roadways, we can grow our economy and relatively help our environment. And of course, there's a good way to do that. You vote for people like Jody Wagner, Sabrina Wooten, Bill Dale, Brandon Hutchins, and myself, and we can work toward improvement on that matter.
Thank you, Mr. Schesventer. Glad you were able to join us. And we'll move to our third question, which will be asked by Jim Deppie.
Jim, you're muted.
Thank you. Our third question subject area is pandemic and revenue shortfalls. Each candidate will have 1.5 minutes to answer this question or these questions. Background, the COVID pandemic has impacted everyone. Many people have been laid off. Some small business owners have suffered big losses. Families have had to accommodate distance learning while also working from home. We are all living with a heightened level of anxiety and worry. In addition, all levels of government are adjusting to reduced revenues. The first part is, what should the city council be doing to address the challenges these challenges in our community? And then where will you make budget cuts to adjust to reduced revenues? And will your recommended cuts be horizontal or vertical? And our first answer will be, let's see, from Jessica, Kempsville.
Thank you. Well, I'd first like to lead off with our city council was able to pass a very lean and flexible budget this cycle, and we are doing quite well as a city. Our revenue forecasts are up over what we anticipated, and we are in a much better position than we thought we would be. And I'd like to take this opportunity to kind of tell you how we got there. when we initially met with our previous our interim city manager, we had a recommended budget that we pretty much had to scrap, because with the realities of COVID, we knew that some of the things we had wanted to do were not going to be feasible, and we weren't sure what kind of a financial outlook the city was going to have. And I was fortunate enough to partner with Councilman Wood and the mayor and really work hard on trying to find a solution. And we went from having no budget to, in about 48 hours, having a unanimous budget that did not raise taxes and fees, that gave out business grants to not only our residents, but also gave out grants to our businesses. It loosened zoning restrictions so that our businesses could become flexible with how they conducted business in the city. And we not only did that, but we learned that from the state, we were going to lose about $7 million in revenue to our schools, and we were able as a council to restore that $7.7 million back to our school system. So we are in a great situation as it goes relative to the COVID situation. I think we have to be vigilant. We have to think lean and mean. We did have a hiring freeze. We did freeze unnecessary expenditures, and we are working to make sure that we are always putting our top priorities first. And those priorities remained, the typical ones: public safety, our schools, and funding flood mitigation, as well as making sure the CARES Act funding is distributed equitably amongst our city and is going to the top needs of the people that need it most.
Thank you, Jessica. And next is Bill Dale.
Yeah, I believe that the virus and the pandemic is probably the most serious issue facing the city at the present time. I believe it'll continue for 15 to 18 months, and I don't think we've seen the worst of it yet. I applaud the work of the council, particularly with the budget, in terms of keeping us relatively prepared for what is coming. But I think that the economic concerns, we haven't really seen them yet. Since March, Hampton Roads has seen over 500 businesses close. It's probably up to 600 now. But we have to realize that when that takes place, it's generally the people on the lower economic scale who are hurt by that, and the unemployment is really felt among that particular crowd. The tourist industry has done extremely well, seemingly the best on the East Coast, maybe the best in the country. That's a real boon for us. And it's a way to say that that part of the business of the city is a real integral and important thing that has to go on if it's going to allow us to continue. I think we have to expect revenues to drop, and that means there probably will need to be cuts. They should be vertical and not horizontal. There are certain areas of the city, certainly life and safety, that have to be preserved and not cut as harshly, if at all. But I think bottom line, the concern of the council has to be the well-being, the life and the safety of the citizens of the beach, and our budget has to reflect that as a major concern.
Thank you, Bill. And next is the Rose Hall districts, beginning with Garry Hubbard.
Yes, thank you. As the only businessman and military veteran running in the Rose Hall district, I look at this as a business. The city needs a strong fiscal financial policy. I would look at each and every budget that we have now and assess it as it's needed. In business, you look at things that are viable for a viable future. Bill Dale is 100% right. We're facing a harsh reality with the virus and devastating economic times. We've got to denote and make a difference between what the city wants and what the city needs. The very definition of the city is what the amenities that they offer and provide. So we've got to look at all budgets. We've got to look at our hiring. We've got to maybe institute a freeze. We've got to be serious about this because these are serious and perilous times that we're facing. As a businessman, I know how to make this happen. I know what budgets we need to cut, what budgets we need to look at, and how we make the future and a viable future to go ahead in these times. Just because you can open up a restaurant doesn't mean there's people with handfuls of cash coming down to be your customer base. So we've got to institute not only transparency, but we've got to institute trust with the citizens of Virginia Beach. And I believe that's how we're going to go forward in pushing this and making sure that our city of Virginia Beach is still a viable city and make sure we actually have what we need and not what we want. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. And next is Michael Berlucci.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to share a little bit about what your city council has done so far and a little bit about what I anticipate we will do in the future. As was mentioned, we're in a much stronger position than we anticipated, and that's in part to the measures that were implemented just at the very beginning of this pandemic, including wise, nimble, strategic, responsive budgetary techniques, and as well supporting businesses through the summer to do the very best we can to open Virginia Beach, not only at the resort, but across our city, to support small businesses by changing rules, changing regulations, being adaptive and open to new ideas. And then the next step really is the implementation of the tens of millions of dollars we're getting from the federal government in CARES Act funding. And those resources can be used for a variety of purposes, but in Virginia Beach, we're directing them toward businesses, small and large, toward residents in the support and various different levels of support, and to nonprofits. And that's a key piece that I've been a very strong advocate for, because nonprofits in the community are best positioned to support our most underserved neighbors. We just received a briefing last night about the wonderful programs that our city is implementing with Hampton Roads Workforce Development Council, with the Food Bank of Southeastern Virginia and the Eastern Shore, with the United Way, to really serve our community. So we're doing great, and we still have some work to do, though. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. And next is Conrad Schesventer.
Want to strengthen our community. I would say don't cut school budgets, reform policing. While we should attract business, we shouldn't scoff at helping others afford to live here. And if I had the power, the council isn't really designed in its budget to do this, but if I had the power, I would direct our tourism funds more toward flooding and help set up the bond referendum to work on borrowing more money for flooding fixes. Now, yes, the budget is tight. Every single city budget is going to be tight. That's because city budgets rely on property taxes, sales taxes, and we cannot afford to cut them for a small return on investment that otherwise blows a hole in our city budget. We can lose some regulations, though. We need state and federal money to help invest in things like flooding and social equity and expansion. That way we don't have to do too much cutting. And I would say, if you want to do all that, you know the basics. Vote for Jody Wagner, Sabrina Wooten, Bill Dale, Brandon Hutchins, and myself. And as a collective, we can aim for a more active way so that we can be expansive and not fearful going forward.
Thank you, Conrad. And finally, to Centerville District, Sabrina Wooten.
Yes, the state of the region has reported that there's been a loss of 87,000 jobs throughout our region. And those jobs have been lost in healthcare, retail, hospitality, and of course have trickled down to Virginia Beach. However, you know, in seeing the loss of jobs, the question is very pertinent, because with our residents who are struggling with loss in employment, we don't want to see taxes be raised, and we do want to look for opportunities to reduce taxes. In the budget that was presented this year, there were a significant amount of taxes to our education. Regretfully and unfortunately, you know, there were job freezes and there were some job cuts. And so I think what we're going to have to do is institute and look forward in a recovery plan, because this virus is steady. We are faring well, but it's not over. And so we're going to, as a council, have to continue to look at our position on a continual basis. And then we're going to have to look at ways of where we can recover and what those priorities will be, and take advantage of opportunities to cut taxes in those appropriate areas. One of the areas that I can say has been positive for Virginia Beach is tourism. And the council did make a significant investment in marketing our tourism industry to the region so that we could capitalize in that area during the pandemic. So I think that's a very significant move that council made to try to address some of the issues that we're having during the pandemic.
Thank you, Sabrina. And for our fourth question, I'll turn it back over to Karen.
Thank you, Jim. Our fourth question deals with sea level rise and coastal flooding, what we see as the most pressing and complex issue facing the city. Virginia Beach has invested time and resources into developing the sea level rise plan to address sea level rise and increased flooding. The study looks at all 5 of our major watersheds, the Atlantic, the Lynnhaven, the Elizabeth, Back Bay, and the North Landing. And it outlines 4 areas for future work: nature-based strategies, engineered defenses, adapting structures, and policy changes. How we use this data and move forward with implementing these recommendations is vitally important to our city. You'll have 3 minutes for responses to these questions. Number 1, what are the greatest flooding risks in your district? What process do you propose for prioritizing the risks and implementing mitigation measures needed by the entire city of Virginia Beach? Costs associated with each of these adaptation framework components are significant. How would you prioritize, fund, and implement these flood control opportunities? And 4th, what is your position on the issue of managed retreat and the need to restrict development in flood-prone and future flood-prone areas? And we will begin our responses with the Rose Hall District, Conrad Schesventer.
All right. Managed retreat and restricted floodplain development is what we should do if we thought of the city's future like a chess game. The pressure is coming from a creeping ocean, slightly higher rivers and bays. Our land is slowly dropping. And like touched on earlier, we're clearing needed vegetation that holds back flooding. But we need to think beyond our city budget. We need to think more like a slow emergency. Remember how it was deemed an emergency and banned for the cost of an aircraft carrier. We put on billions for portions of a border wall. We need to act as a team with local state delegates and senators and federal representatives so we treat our area like the slow emergency that it is. The joint land use study from last year for just Norfolk and Virginia Beach found that protecting area military infrastructure alone will cost upwards of $5 billion. We shouldn't act scared. We should act bold. And that begins right here with flooding construction in Rose Halls, Princess Anne Plaza, Windsor Woods. I live here in Chimney Hill. Make sure it's the best it can possibly be. We can't afford to cut things like schools or roadways and other basic infrastructure. We can reshift toward better transit, less approval for development on the coast and on our bays, and work as the strongest team we can to bring in other forms of government revenue. We'll need a strong team in order to do that, starting with Jody Wagner, Sabrina Wooten, Bill Dale, Brandon Hutchins, and myself to kick this off.
Thank you. Michael Berlucchi.
Well, as I mentioned before, I have the privilege and great responsibility of serving from the Rose Hall District, where we face a variety of challenges to flooding and have a history of devastating impacts of flooding. And that's not a responsibility that I take lightly. I wasn't on city council in 2016 when Hurricane Matthew occurred, but I did watch as my neighbors' homes were destroyed, and more than that, as their lives were disrupted. Their property was damaged, their families were impacted, and I watch the levels of anxiety that my neighbors and friends endure every time there's a rainstorm or an approaching hurricane or tropical storm. It's devastating, not only to property, but to our families, and it's devastating emotionally. It's a very, very serious issue, and one that requires our best minds and best efforts to reduce the impact of recurrent flooding and mitigate the impact that it has on our lives. So what we have to do is a combination of natural solutions and engineered solutions. We're making great progress thanks to the studies that have been conducted, thanks to public engagement, and we're beginning to see the effects of the flood control projects that have been implemented both in the Rose Hall district and really across the city. But we know that we have a tremendous amount of work to do, and that work is going to require a tremendous amount of funding. And so it's going to require having council members and policymakers who will prioritize investing the highest percentage of the budget that we possibly can into flood control projects, as well as maintenance and operations. And I've been a strong advocate for enhanced maintenance and operations. And it's going to require state and federal cooperation. And one of the ideas that's been considered is whether we should have a referendum to ask the residents of Virginia Beach if they would consider investing more in flood control projects. And I think they would, and I think it's reasonable that we consider that option potentially next year as a method to generate more revenue with which we can invest in flood control projects so that our neighborhoods are safer, so that those levels of anxiety can become reduced, and we have greater public confidence in the strategies that we're taking. Thank you. I wish I had more time.
Thank you. Gary Hubbard.
Yes, thank you, Karen. I've looked at this situation, and I think we can finally put it to rest that the changing of our climate and sea level rise and the migration of our plants and animals is a scientific fact. Now, Hampton Roads area will not escape this. So we've got to look at solutions and finally get some decisions and quit kicking the can down the road. Our infrastructure is old and crumbling and inadequate. We no longer understand how water runs downhill. It doesn't run uphill. So we've got to actually change the dynamic of our way of thinking. If we don't change our infrastructure to handle the flows of water that now must be handled simply because we've covered all of the ground and the density of our building projects, and we keep doing this, so we've got to understand that our land is sinking, subsidence is real. So how do we pay for this? Our roads to Sandbridge, our roads to Pongo, the interruption of business, the catastrophic cost to the homeowners and businesses in general. So we need to actually look at this, but this has got to be a viable solution. Yes, we're going to have to look to the state and the federal government to see if we can actually fund these projects that we're going to have to do. This is not a pay me now, pay me later type of deal. We have to actually institute these programs. We can actually dredge our holding ponds, clean our ditches, and take the first step. Any journey begins with the first step. If we don't do this, we're going to pay for it much later. There's a cost of over $5 billion that I've looked at in some of the studies. Even the UN is weighing in on these situations. So we're going to have to get with our think tanks. And as a coastal city, we've got to understand that these are things that we must do. Our businesses rely on it. The very citizens of Virginia Beach rely on it. And the Navy and the military is actually calling this a security risk. So our resilience has to be brought up to speed. How we're going to pay for it. And as a businessman, I will look at all the budgets, rely on our delegates, rely on our senators, and rely on the federal government to see what we can do about one of our coastal cities. We're one of many that's going to be relying on this money, so we need to make sure we need to start now and quit kicking the can down the road. We're going to have to restore our wetlands, restore our buffer systems, and actually make a concerted effort to stop the flooding in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move to the Centerville district. Sabrina Wooten.
So as I mentioned earlier, of course, in my district, there are certainly areas that flood in the Centerville district. And one of the challenges that I have noticed and hear from residents is the fact of maintenance. Many, many years of failed maintenance and delayed maintenance. In fact, when I was out talking with members in the community, a gentleman shared with me that an area in Windsor Woods, 2 years ago, our engineers said that they would come out and address the issues. And it's been 2 years and no one has come out to address those areas and those drainage problems. So that's a serious challenge for us in the city, is really getting on a reasonable and an expedited maintenance schedule to address flooding. That's something that we can do now. And I think in looking at all of the challenges that we're having, residents want to know, what can we do now? And that's an area where our city council really needs to focus on. I really think it's been important that the city of Virginia Beach did become a part of the American Flood Coalition, because that is a solution. And when City Council approved becoming a part of that coalition, it gives us access on a national stage to natural resources. For instance, there's a program that the AFC brought to my attention, which I also brought to the attention of our staff and our city manager, the BRIC program. And the BRIC program is essential because it looks at a lot of our vulnerable areas within the city. And there's a score system that they use to say, this particular area needs to be addressed. And so it will help prioritize the vulnerable areas, and that funding goes directly to those areas. And also that BRIC program will help us prioritize some of the larger programs that we have. So this is a huge opportunity for the city of Virginia Beach to take advantage of some resources now with the BRIC program. The AFC has a website. They have tools that citizens can go on and use and put the information in. And it provides, a lot of good resources for not only the city, but our communities. And so I think if we continue to focus on making those areas that are vulnerable a priority, prioritizing some of those large projects with the BRIC program that we have and other programs like it, and then also ensuring that we address our maintenance schedule, making it more reasonable, viable, and expedited. Some of the problems that we have, will be addressed, and we won't have the major flooding that we have and that we see in places like Windsor Woods.
Thank you. We'll go to the Kempsville district, and we'll start with Bill Dale.
Thank you. I think the most pressing need right off the top is the flooding issue in the beach. And I think a few others have already mentioned solution. I'd be strongly in favor of a bond issue, putting it before the community. But I also remember one of the reasons bond issues are not that popular is because the council has in the past floated a bond issue and then decided after the bond came in that they'd use the money for something beside what they were proposing it for. And so there's a lack of trust sometimes when we talk about bond. I'd make it ironclad that if a referendum is done, it's going to be used for flood mitigation and everything connected with it, and not a dime goes anyplace else. I think the community would support that. And then the first thing I do following that is to listen to the engineers and see what can be done with those, particularly those 14 communities, to put them in a position where flooding is not that critical an issue. In my own community in Kempsville, it's not as critical as some other areas. In Larkspur, there's flooding when there's too much rain. The streets flood and some are not passable, but it's nowhere near some of the other communities in the city. In terms of longer range, that's sea level rise. The fact of the matter is we're not going to stop it. Everybody realizes that. But I think we can do things to protect ourselves from them. The study in March, I think, pointed that out significantly. Policy-wise, I would do nothing below what we call the green line. Certainly down in the Pungo area in terms of development in those wetlands areas. I think that's just, it's invading a watershed. I think it's just opening us up for more flooding and more concern as we move further along that plane. I know some developers who, when they've developed some of these large areas, I think of Red Mill with the retention ponds there, when they were in charge of the properties, people who lived along those retention ponds were not allowed to put swimming pools in their backyards. Why? Because it would weaken the banks, the retention ponds would erode and start to fill in. Well, what happens over time is people forget that, and then pools start being put in and development takes place along those retention ponds, and then you have a significant problem that the whole community is impacted by. That may be something that the city can stick its nose in, or zoning can take its zone in, that when a developer develops a property and puts some limitations on it for the sake of preserving it, maybe there's an obligation to pick that up and continue that even when the initial owner of that property has left the area. So there's some policy changes, there's some quick changes. I think flooding first, regionally, with military, with government, and with state, that's how we deal with the more pressing need of sea level rise and erosions that take place because of that.
Thank you. And Jessica Abbott.
Thank you. Well, to answer the question, the biggest issue in Kempsville is aging infrastructure, and I'd argue that that's probably the biggest issue across the city. Much of our city was developed before we had the information that we have now. Also unique to Kempsville is the Elizabeth River, and we have a lot of severe repetitive loss properties that are along the Elizabeth River, which is why the Ferry Point project was so important to the district. And we do have a number of wetlands in Kempsville as well. I would agree that we are not the most pressing, we are not the top community in terms of pressing need, and that we should prioritize the communities that have the biggest need first. I think council has been very vocal on their line of, our first job is to keep water out of houses. And if we can't do that, then we're failing and we're creating a public health hazard that cannot be acceptable. The truth of the matter is all of these things, this wish list that we talk about all the time with the Dewberry study and the sea level rise and all of it, it's a very, very big bill. And we do need to have a bond referendum, and that bond referendum does need to be limited to flooding mitigation in those projects. In 2016, the city spent about $20 million on flood control capital improvement programs. Since I've been on council, we've spent over $152 million on flooding related projects in our CIP. We have to continue that. I've been very vocal in advocating for more funding quicker. 15 years is not sustainable. Most people don't live in their house that long. And if they do, that's a half of a mortgage, and that's not fair to ask of people. I think with a bond referendum, we could potentially get that down to 6 years. And we need to be realistic with residents of what a bond referendum would mean in terms of the cost to them and how we would facilitate those funds, especially with regionalism in terms of working with our surrounding communities. I think about the Elizabeth River, that's Norfolk's river too. And we have a tide gate project there that we'd like to do one day that we can't accomplish without cooperation in Norfolk. So there's some really great opportunities that we can engage our neighboring cities on as well. You also asked about a voluntary acquisition program. I'm supportive of a voluntary acquisition program, particularly for areas that really shouldn't have ever been developed, but also in terms of if we have flood projects coming down the road, where if somebody wanted to turn their house, sell their house to the city so that we could build a project there, I think that's a good idea, and we should be open to what that could come into fruition to be.
Thank you very much. And for our fifth question, we'll go to Jim.
Thanks, Karen. The final question is regarding diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice issues. During the past year across the country and in our own city, we have experienced heightened awareness of the need to address racial and social inequities. The COVID pandemic has exposed some of these equity problems. Issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice are being examined in families, communities, organizations, businesses, and government. Environmental justice is an important part of that dialogue. And so, as you can see on the small screen, there are 4 pieces of this question. Number 1, how can Virginia Beach become more inviting to all people? Number 2, what can we do to ensure that all people have access to open space and natural areas? Number 3, how can we ensure the poorer communities do not suffer the greatest challenges and losses from sea level rise and increased flooding? And finally, what can the City Council do to make sure all residents have a voice in important decisions? And so each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer this question, and we'll begin with Centerville, Sabrina Wooten.
Well, I'd like to say that as we know, there has been, civil unrest all over our nation. And one of the areas that we have focused on in Virginia Beach is our disparity study. And I have had the opportunity to sponsor resolutions that addressed every disparity recommendation, and they were approved by our city council. So I think, you know, first we've had to look at where we are as a city, acknowledge the disparity that we've had in our city for, you know, many years. I think that's a huge step in the right direction to hear and articulate the voice of the citizens, because there were marches regarding the disparity. There's a study, and there was a cry out to address the disparity. So I think that's the first step that we have taken as a body to move forward and address the disparity with implementing those resolutions. You know, in terms of addressing the disparity throughout our city, I think it's going to be important, and experts say, you know, it's important for us to look at ways to bridge the gap within our city, and do that with our community stakeholders, and also look into having a citizens review panel. And that is something that our General Assembly is looking into, but experts say that's the best way to address the issues that we're having in disparity, and being more welcoming to those who want to come to our city. So I think if residents and those who are looking at coming to our city see us taking steps to address the disparity, active steps, real steps, I think we'll become a more welcoming, and I think we are working in the right direction to be a more welcoming city, and we can continue to take those steps as well.
Thank you, Sabrina. And next we'll go to Kempsville, Jessica Abbott.
Thank you. Well, I think as representatives, we have a responsibility and an obligation to promote an equitable community. And I feel like, at least in the last 4 years that I've been on council, we have really tried to take steps to really embody that statement. Councilwoman Wooten mentioned the disparity study. I was the first council member to support the disparity study. I've walked at every disparity study march. I was 30 weeks pregnant during the last one, and I really believe in it. And you know, I, along with my colleagues, fought to make sure that the disparity study recommendations that we had passed earlier remained fully funded in our budget cycle, despite the COVID, the new realities of COVID-19. We also have to really work hard on our police force and recruitment. That is probably one of our biggest challenges in terms of the public safety realm. We have to make sure that our police department reflects the community that it serves. I think we need to put a heightened impact on how we recruit and the recruitment techniques we use to make sure that more women and more people of color get to be a part of our police department, a part of all of our public safety for that matter, as well as enhance our community policing policies and making sure that there's a really great foundation of trust. I'd also say that one of the other big things we've done in this council is getting a new city manager. It's no surprise that I was very critical of our former city manager, mainly because I didn't think he embodied that. In the first statement I said, I don't think he used language that was representative of the kind of community we want to be. And so because we were willing to part ways with that relationship, we've brought on a great city manager who I am so excited to have, and I know he's going to do amazing things for our community. And Mr. Duhaney is really a jewel for our community, and I think that speaks to the forward thinkingness of this council.
Thank you, Jessica. And next, Bill Dale.
I think the first thing to remember is Virginia Beach is a tourist community. And that means if we're going to be successful, we've got to be welcoming. And the fact that people come from all over the East Coast and all over the country to this area says that something must be working. And if you go down to the ocean front, you know, anytime from April until September, October, you see people from everywhere representing every walk of life, unbelievable diversity that is there. And not only that, but many of them keep coming back. So they must find something here that they appreciate and like. And I think we need to build on that all the time. That doesn't mean we have to be Pollyannish. Systemic racism exists here just as it exists everywhere else. but I think that we are strong enough as a community to be able to address it and to address it reasonably. As far as the police department, I think they're victims of what's happening nationally. What I've been saying when talking to voters is that the perception is much worse than the reality. You can't be the third safest city in the country without having a police force that really is doing a great job. I agree very much with Jessica, though, that I'd like to see more women on the force. I think it would change the culture of the police force, and I think there's a different response on the streets from women as opposed to men. And it might be real positive as far as that goes. But first and foremost, I'd give our new police chief, all the time that he needs to make the changes that he thinks are important, and I don't want to get in the way of that. I'd finish up by saying that, I'm really very, very positive about this city and about the way that diversity has become very much a part of the community. We see it in terms of the wide areas where people live. I think the fact that we're very heavily military is a positive factor that ensures some of that takes place, and it puts us in a better position than many other communities in this country.
Thank you, Bill. And we'll move on to the Rose Hall District now. And first up will be Michael Berlucci.
Thank you for asking this question, because the discussion about diversity and inclusion and accessibility is one that I am deeply personally passionate about. Prior to serving on City Council, I was a member of the Virginia Beach Human Rights Commission, and I served as president of Hampton Roads Pride for 2 terms, and I serve on the board of directors and as a volunteer for a number of other community organizations with which this mission is a critical part of their focus. And it was really the driving force for my inspiration toward public service, that ultimately Virginia Beach can become a community where every single person has the opportunity to fulfill their full potential. And that really should be the goal of government, and it certainly is the goal of my efforts in public service. And so I think there are a variety of ways we can achieve that goal. The first is to make sure that every single person is treated with the dignity and respect that we all deserve as human beings. Part of that is culturally, and it's up to us as leaders to help to set that tone. And part of it can be implemented with policy. Of course, I'm a supporter of the recommendations of the disparity study, and I participated in the first march as a citizen, as a supporter of that effort. And I'm proud to continue to support those efforts to address the disparities and to eliminate discrimination in city contracting. But we also have to help create an environment where every single person has access to opportunity, not only in city contracting, but in business in general. And I think that's a perfect segue into the other parts of the question about making sure that people have access to open space and natural areas, and that people become engaged in the important decisions. Because if people have access to economic opportunity, they'll have a chance to enjoy our natural areas and open spaces. Civic engagement, frankly, is a luxury. And if you are struggling economically, you may not have a chance to participate in civic discussions. And so I think the better we move forward that goal, the better chances people will have to enjoy our natural spaces and participate in our democracy. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. And next up is Conrad Schesventer.
Making sure all Virginia Beach citizens have a voice will require balance. Reduce the siren song of big developer money, because not all Virginia Beach citizens have that power. Strengthen the voice of VB citizens by granting them a representative democracy filled with districts where their voice isn't drowned out by the whole city. Lower income communities can be helped if we choose to help. Last year, when interviewed by the VBAAPAC, I floated the idea of grants to hotels to house homeless during the winter, and it gained no traction. Then COVID hit. The city took grants and decided to try that out. It takes willpower from a whole council. Start affordable housing in areas that are on solid footing on flood infrastructure, and you're on your way. Make sure they can get around with rapid bus transit, and they can even get to see our secured open spaces. You want to make sure this place is inviting to all people, make it just as safe and economically sound for someone starting college as it is for someone who owns multiple beachfront hotels. Reform policing, strengthen police accountability, so various communities won't feel so intimidated. We'll all be on our way to that by voting for Jody Wagner, Sabrina Wooten, Bill Dale, Brandon Hutchins, and myself for a more progressive council.
Thank you, Conrad. And finally, Gary, over to you.
Thank you, Jim. You know, as a businessman over the years since 1981, I've made it a point that when I hired women or when I hired minority, that we actually had an inclusive business arrangement. Norman Goodlow and myself, we started a program that enhanced women-owned contractors, minority-owned contractors, and we made it a point to help the contractors themselves on how to bid with other general contractors, and also economic and environmental, and actually making sure that entrepreneurship is alive and well on that end of it, and being able to bid with the cities, localities, and even the government. There's two words that come to mind: transparency and trust. Without transparency, there is no trust. Diversity is a strength, it's not a weakness. And we need to actually have the transparency in our city government so we can have that trust that our citizens so deserve. Without equity, there is no parity. We are looking at a social, economic, and stratified racial tensions that we need to actually be able to sit down without animosity and actually talk to one another for a change instead of actually confronting each other. Whether it's in our police force, our fire force, or it's in the citizens itself entirely. As a businessman, I understand what diversity is, and I understand what minority contractors are. There is no level playing field as we see it now. The disparity study clearly showed that we do not have equity. So we need to actually make a concerted effort to level the playing field for all the citizens of Virginia Beach, and a rising tide lifts all boats. It shouldn't leave just one behind. So we need to look at how we can actually enhance the citizens of Virginia Beach instead of having mayhem and rioting and looting. Let's look together, build together, and work together. As a businessman, I have that experience. As a military veteran, I have that experience. And I believe we can go forward with each other and not leave no one behind. Thank you, Jim.
We thank all of you for tackling these complex questions and for your very thoughtful responses. Any of these questions was worthy of a 90-minute discussion. We will now close with your closing statements, and each candidate will have 2 minutes. And we'll begin with the Kempsville district. Bill Dale will be first.
Thank you very much. And once again, thank you all for having us and listening to us for this hour and a half's time. I've lived in Kempsville for close to 40 years. And in my time here, one of my joys has been involving myself in the community, going back, way back, started the Virginia Beach Coalition for the Homeless and the Winter Shelter Program using churches, following the memorable Greek Fest event with a few other people. We organized the Virginia Beach Chaplains and served on that for 5 years. At the same time, belonged to the Labor Day Community Coordinating Committee. It was 60 people in the beach, businessmen and people from different walks of life, to see how could we respond to the Labor Day events and create something that was going to make a better place for all of our citizens to live in. Had the opportunity to organize and serve as the first chair for the investigative review panel. Didn't turn out as well as we anticipated from the beginning, but it was a great start, and Jim Spore needs to be credited with starting something that nobody else had been doing at the time. Started the Human Rights Commission with a group of 20 people, met for a year with assistance from the federal government, and presented that to council, called that into being, and I look back on that as one of my most successful efforts. Served for 12 years on the Human Rights Committee, on the City Personnel Board. There's too many committees, plus others. All I'm saying is that I come at this with a good deal of experience that I'd like to be able to share, to be able to use. The commonality was everything was done in conjunction with a lot of other people, nothing alone, nothing by myself. I look forward to an opportunity to serve with 10 other people who really have what is best for the city at their heart, and would ask for your vote in the election coming up.
Thank you, Bill Dale. Jessica Abbott.
Thank you. Well, I'll echo. Thank you so much for having us. It has been a strange campaign season. I think all of us would agree with that, and
Yes.
and the ways that we can get out and share our thoughts and our ideas with you all who are involved in our community. This is a great opportunity. So thank you. I neglected to mention that one of the reasons I ran in 2016 was because I wanted to make sure that all perspectives were represented on our council. I am a mom of 2 kids. I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. My husband's a Virginia Beach school teacher at SeaTac Elementary School and teaches 4th grade. And I'm a small business owner in Virginia Beach. In my professional life, I'm an insurance agent and a FEMA certified flood insurance agent. And I spend a tremendous amount of time looking at flood maps and looking at how those have changed in the last decade. And so I think I bring a really important perspective to the city, and that is that we're made up of a lot of young families. 25% of our city is under the age of 35. We need to have representation on council, and we need to be able to influence the way the city is changing and growing. Because the truth of the matter is that we're going to bear the impact 20, 30, 40 years down the road. And I want to make sure that working moms have a voice on our council and are able to really influence the direction of that body. And I really will have to say I would really like to also take a moment and say thank you to the people that put me on city council in 2016. The last 4 years have been such a distinguished honor for me, and there is nothing more than I would like to do than serve another 4 years as your district representative and really give back to my community. This has been a wonderful experience, and I really look forward to the amazing opportunities our city has, because we really are a great city and we are moving in the right direction, and I think good things are to come. So if you're voting early, please vote for me, Jessica Abbott, or on November 3rd. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica Abbott. And we'll move to the Rose Hall district, and we'll start with Garry Hubbard.
Well, thank you, Karen. Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Helen. I appreciate this venue, and I appreciate Lynnhaven River NOW's training and their dedication to our environment and our waterways. As you know, I'm a small businessman and a military veteran. As a small businessman, I'm used to making the hard decisions. One of the reasons our city is in trouble now, with the reason we have these problems, is the lack of decision. Their indecision has put us in a very financial shortfall, or actually, quite frankly, they should have made decisions to work with mitigating flooding and work with the other avenues, and they don't understand the difference between wants and needs. I understand these situations. I understand the reasons that we need to make decisions now. We have a situation that we need to move our city forward, and we're going to need somebody that has experience in both business and also as the military, as one of the largest areas contractors or employers, how and what their needs are. So we need to do this. I hope people will vote for me and vote for experience and vote for Garry Hubbard for City Council, Rose Hall District. I represent one of the districts that is extremely one catastrophic storm away from extreme damage, and we need to make sure that we are doing all we can to address this issue once and for all and stop kicking the cans down the road. And without transparency and trust, we cannot do this. So we need to make sure we're going to actually put somebody in council that can make the hard decisions. I intend to make a decision, yes or no, and I'll tell you why, yes or no. I intend to build coalitions and consensus with my fellow council members and women councilwomen so we can move our city forward and stop spinning our wheels in indecision and lack of decision making. Thank you, and vote for me, and I will work the hardest I possibly can to move our city forward and put us in a strong financial situation without continuously impacting the citizens of Virginia Beach that are now faced with devastating economic times. Thank you for your time, and I thank you, and I look forward to the
Thank
future
you,
with
Hubbard.
Lynnhaven. Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Garry Hubbard. And we'll move on to Conrad Schesventer.
Virginia Beach is a great city, but just because something is great doesn't mean it can't be improved. Virginia Beach can use positive enhancements, and an active city council can work toward that. An active city council can work toward better flood mitigation, toward rapid bus transit, toward affordable housing, toward economic diversity beyond tourism, toward social justice, toward reduced gun violence. The Virginia Beach Democratic Committee recommends a team to do just that. That team is Jody Wagner for mayor, Sabrina Wooten for Centerville, Bill Dale for Kempsville, Brandon Hunchitz at large, and Conrad Schesventer for Rose Hall. Early voting is taking place now, all the way through the big day of November 3rd. Let's vote for even better. Thank you, Lynnhaven River Now, for having us.
Thank you, Conrad Schesventer. And we'll go to Michael Berlucchi.
Thanks again, and I want to thank all the candidates in Lynnhaven River Now for participating in this great forum. My name is Michael Berlucci, and I serve on our City Council from the Rose Hall District, and I'm proud to be a member of our City Council because I'm excited about the chance to be part of a team that makes Virginia Beach even better than we already are. But for the purposes of this closing remarks, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my policies toward protecting our really fragile coastal ecosystems, because I'm the only candidate in this race with a record of doing just that. I've advanced a program called CPACE, which is called Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy. This is a program which will make resiliency and energy efficiency improvements on commercial and multifamily properties in Virginia Beach. Our city conducted a study. We just received an update yesterday. We expect implementation in the second quarter of next year. I was the sponsor of a resolution to affirm our support for offshore wind, which will bring jobs and clean energy to Virginia Beach. And I was a co-sponsor of a resolution to affirm our opposition toward offshore drilling just this year. I'm an advocate for protecting trees as well as for native species plants, both in city landscaping and in private and commercial landscaping. I'm a strong proponent of natural as well as engineered solutions to recurrent flooding and sea level rise. Those two have to work hand in hand. And I voted for stormwater regulations proposed by our staff that will improve both water quality and will mitigate the impacts of flooding in our neighborhoods and throughout our city. So I hope that you're proud of the efforts that I've made just in 1 year on the issues that I know are important to you. And if you give me a chance to serve for 4 more years, I look forward to what we can achieve together. I'm Michael Berlucci, and I'm here to ask for your vote and for your support. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael Berlucci. And we'll close with Sabrina Wooten in the Centerville district.
I've been blessed to serve in the Centerville district for the last year and about 10 months. And since that time, it has been my great honor and pleasure to advocate and to work on many of the issues that we've already discussed tonight. Diversity and inclusion. I've had the opportunity to sponsor all of, except one bill that I helped co-sponsor or resolution to address the disparity recommendations and to ensure that they were fully funded in our budget. That's an important matter for our city. And I was pleased to be able to represent and push forward those resolutions with the approval of our body and city council. I also had the opportunity to address flooding. I sponsored the American Flood Coalition resolution that made the city of Virginia Beach a part of the AFC that provides natural resources to help us address flooding, to help us address sea level rise. And I also had an opportunity to address and to work on the pandemic issue, especially as it relates to our local businesses. I host a Ignite Business series that provides tools and resources to help our local businesses grow and expand. And that resource and those opportunities were really needed during our pandemic. And I am committed to continuing to advocate in all of these areas, as well as education, as well as homelessness and human trafficking, the opioid crisis, and many other areas if you go to my website at sabrinawooten.com, you will see that many of these areas are a part of my platform. And I'm committed to continuing to work with the citizens of Virginia Beach, our city council, our city officials, to continue to make sure that our city moves forward during this really difficult time. I ask you on November 3rd, and if you choose to vote early, to vote for me, Sabrina Wooten, and go to sabrinawooten.com so that I can be reelected to continue the great work that I started.
Thank you, Sabrina Wooten. A reminder to everyone that we have been recording tonight's forum, and that recording will be available tomorrow on our LR Now YouTube channel. We will send all participants an email with a link to that recording and encourage you to share it with your neighbors and friends. We thank everyone for joining us tonight, and a big thank you to all of the candidates for sharing your valuable time with us and for your willingness to serve our city. So thank you. Please vote on or before November 3rd. Thank you and good night.